It's good to see all of you tonight. I will make mention to you that when I was putting the video screen together for both the YouTube feed and what you see in here, there's more left in chapter 7 than I realized when I put that video together. So the video screen was telling you chapter 8. We're not quite there, almost there. But we got a little bit left over in chapter 7 to finish up, which is actually then lesson 4. So the end of lesson 4, beginning of lesson 5, that's where we're going to be in our study together this evening. And so, and by the way, I know we had some transition with teachers and so forth. If anybody needs a full copy, I do still have full copies of the study of Ezekiel. If you need that, just come see me, and I can get you that copy of the full set if you haven't grabbed a copy of that full set of lesson sheets from the book of Ezekiel. And for those that are joining us online, you can go to our website at PaganCityChurchOfChrist.com, which maybe you've already found us that way anyway, but and you can download the study guide from the web page. We're in Ezekiel chapter 7. We want to, if you're looking at the lesson sheets and you can see the two sides of the screen, we're on question 8, and it relates to that segment that begins there in verse 14 of chapter 7. So let's begin to look again at the book of Ezekiel. They have blown, speaking of those back in Jerusalem, this imagery that Ezekiel's receiving is about the events and circumstances and things that are happening there. He'll have some similar kinds of things happen in chapter 8, although those are more visions of the condition of Israel and Judah, or Judah in particular, and Jerusalem. But anyway, we'll get there. Verse 14 of chapter 7. They have blown the trumpet even to make all ready, but none goeth to the battle. For my wrath is upon all the multitude thereof. The sword is without, and the pestilence and the famine within. And he that is in the field shall die with the sword, and he that is in the city, famine and pestilence shall devour him. But they that escape of them shall escape, and shall be on the mountains like doves of the valleys, all of them mourning, every one for his iniquity. All hands shall be feeble, and all knees shall be weak as water. And they shall also gird themselves with sackcloth, and horror shall cover them, and shame shall be upon all faces, and baldness upon all their heads. And so the question basically that was asked out of this text was what's the state or condition of the military, the people that are serving as soldiers in that day?
No one will go to battle.
Okay, so even if you have a guy that can do what?
Throw a spear.
Well, what's the word he uses in there? Okay, well, I'm still, let me back you up in the text. Now, maybe I'm not getting you far enough back. So what's he doing in verse 14? He's blowing a trumpet. He's calling them, and he could call all day, but nobody's what? Nobody's coming, right? That's the first stage of this situation, how bleak it's getting. Because typically, the way they would function is they would blow the trumpet, which was basically the means by which they would give calls to various military individuals to know what it is they should be doing. Remind you a lot. In fact, that didn't really go away for a long, long time. That methodology of communicating certain things to military folks, and then there's still, even to this day, some symbolic relationship of how they do that. And so here's this scene where this trumpet's being blown, but nobody's listening. Nobody is responding or reacting. If you recall, to give you just an imagery of using that, in Judges chapter 7, you learn about what individual, if you think of it real quick. He used just a handful of soldiers. I'm giving you the first number of them. Gideon, right? Okay. So Gideon, right? Gideon had too many soldiers initially, and he whittles it down to 3 companies of 100, 300 men. But what weapons of warfare did they have? That's right, with a light inside of it. So you had a trumpet in one hand and a light inside a pitcher, and not necessarily great orthodoxy, but he said every single one of them would have that, and at a certain moment in time, they would, all of them, blow the trumpet, break the pitcher, and you think about that imagery. So now the enemy thinks that there are 300 companies, not just 300, because each company would have its own bugler. And each company would have somebody guiding them with a single light. And so the enemy has this imagery of Gideon surrounding them, and it's not just 300 guys. They get the idea, just based on their military understanding, that this is a tremendous army that is about to come in. So much so that they do what? The enemies of the Midianites. Yeah, they turn on each other because they have no idea where all these folks and these soldiers are coming from. So just trying to give you a biblical kind of narrative that might help you think a little bit about what Ezekiel's talking about. So in that day, with Gideon, they used the trumpet, the bugle, the call to actually help them win a battle. Ezekiel is told that there'll come a time there when this besiegement hits that they'll bugle all day long and nobody's coming. There won't be anybody that has the physical strength to be able to come. And it's interesting, he said, none will go to the battle there back in verse 14, for my wrath is upon all the multitude thereof. We've talked a lot about the idea that this whole narrative of Ezekiel, especially in these first several chapters, are really just about setting the stage for a judgment of God that they cannot avoid. They're not going to be able to escape or turn from it. And so they recognize the importance of knowing that these challenges were coming, irregardless of what they do. They could blow for help. They could seek help. They could try to make allegiances, which they did throughout that process. And none of it's going to work. It's interesting, too, because he says in verse 15, where's the sword going to be? Okay, so you think about a walled city, and outside the walls is where the soldiers are, but they can't get to the people who need help on inside. So outside, they're having their own struggles in battle with the sword. On the inside, what's happening? Yeah, pestilence and famine. The besiegement is going to create such hardship among those who still stay established inside the walls, that they'll face difficulties as well. He that's in the field shall die with the sword, and he that is in the city, famine and pestilence shall devour him. Will there be some who escape, at least initially? Yeah, so some might escape, and they'll be on the mountains like doves of the valleys. All of them will be doing what? They'll be in mourning, not just at the devastation that they're witnessing, but they're going to be in mourning because why? Their sin. Yeah. The iniquity that brought that. Since we're talking about the judgment of God, right? Judgment of God on His specific people here in the book of Ezekiel, the New Testament writers speak about the judgment of God as well. And it's interesting because when New Testament writers speak about hell, they speak about it as a place where their worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched. There's this, you think about this worm or this canker, this idea of this continual gnawing at you. There's some parallel here. They're going to look down at the people that are able to escape, and they're going to go, we caused that. Our iniquities, our transgressions, our choices, our decisions to abandon relationship with God, our decisions to go into idolatry, which is what the vision in chapter 8 is going to be about, our choices and purposes to go off and begin to behave in such ways that God said is an abomination before me, those are the very things that cause the calamity, cause the judgment of God, and they know it. And they look down and mourn, and there seems to be similar kind of imagery in the New Testament as those who knew better face consequence and judgment when they recognize the difficulties that they brought upon themselves. It's a very sad scene.
It reminds me of the destructive Jerusalem.
Yeah.
The conditions are similar.
Yeah, and you're right, Bill. And so you fast forward. Here's one destructive moment, and then you fast forward into the descriptions of what's to come, which I believe happens in 70 AD. And so you see that judgment, if you will, though purpose is different, circumstances are different, but it is within the imagery, they're very similar. Absolutely. Other thoughts, questions? And so it's nobody's coming to help. The famine and pestilence is causing so many to die. Those who happen to escape are just in mourning over the condition. Even if there was somebody to help, they're too weak to help, in verse 17. And they shall also gird themselves with sackcloth, and horror shall cover them, and shame shall be upon all faces, and baldness upon all their heads. It's a sad reality of the judgment of God that is to come. Anything else before I... Verse 19. So they shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their mouths, because it is the stumbling block of their iniquity. As for the beauty of his ornament, he set it in majesty, but they made the images of their abominations and of their detestable things therein. And therefore I set it far from them. I will give it into the hands of the strangers for a prey, and to the wicked of the earth for a spoil, and they shall pollute it. And my face will I turn also from them, and they shall pollute my secret place, for the robber shall enter into it and defile it. The question our lesson sheets that we've been using asked simply was, how will then the men of Jerusalem regard the gold and silver in that day? Okay, so the description is that they would throw it in the streets. Why? Okay, potentially because it's worthless. If you don't have anything to buy, your gold and silver won't do you any good. It's just an interesting kind of picture when you think about it. But also what's sad about that is, what had they been trusting all this time? The gold, the silver, the benefits of these earthly things. They had been relying upon those and trusting in them, believing that in many senses that all that they had been doing was what brought them the blessings, when the reality, the only reason they'd been blessed was because of Jehovah, right? Because of God. Now they're reaping what they've sown, and their gold and silver has become so devalued because the besiegement doesn't allow for it to purchase anything because there's no supply. And so it's of no use to them. What's left then, who's going to come and take it? Okay, the strangers, robbers. This enemy that's coming in among them is ultimately going to possess these things. And the secondary question then out of this narrative is, why then had Jehovah appointed this? Why did God do this?
Because they relied on it too much, and he's showing that isn't going to do you any good.
Okay, so partly because they had been trusting and relying upon these monetary gold and silver. Why else is this scene happening? What had they polluted? And if you think about Ezekiel chapter 8, you'll have a better imagery of that, because that's where he's going next. Yeah, they had violated the temple. It was no longer the place where Jehovah was honored. It was the place where any god that they decided to honor that day was honored, and they had defiled it. They had created the defilement in that place. So God just basically says, you chose that path. I'm going to let the stranger come in and do what? Just take it. Even to the what? To my, what's that interesting phrase there in verse 22?
I was about to ask you about that.
Okay. I think he's talking about they're going to be able to get clear into what was sacred in relationship to that temple. And what was a place that no one but the high priest, right? The holy. That's what I see, Brian. I could be wrong, but that's what I see. That God's saying, even that place that very, 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 very few had ever seen, they're going to come and just take over everything. You have relinquished control. Because of your iniquities and behaviors and choices, you have set in motion a judgment of God where where God in His righteousness has decided He can't leave anything undone. All of it is going to be defiled and lost because that's the path they put themselves on. It's a hard, it's kind of hard for us sometimes to make all the connections and appreciate the manner in which God functions. We've talked in the past in relationship to these kinds of studies that God dealt with people differently under that Old Testament system than He does now. We've talked in the past about the fact that in those days God dealt very directly with man. In New Testament times, He deals with us through Jesus, right? He deals with us through Jesus. In sundry times and diverse manners, spoke to the prophets in times past, but these last days speaketh unto us through His Son. He's functioning through Jesus in these days, but He did and dealt very differently. There's parallels and yet there's contrast between His people in that day and today. In that day, they were not just a spiritual body of people, but they were an earthly kingdom, right? And so because they were an earthly kingdom, they needed laws and guidance and regulations and government and various things that earthly nations need in order to sustain themselves. We are a spiritual nation under Jesus, therefore not requiring the same level of earthly connectivity that they needed. And so basically they're going to lose it all. Everything that they once were blessed with because of their relationship with God is now going to all be taken away because they chose it. And in God's righteousness, this judgment can't help but have to come. And that's the imagery here. This isn't just arbitrary. God just didn't get up one day and say, well, I don't like them anymore. I'm going to bring this destruction. This is the path that they put themselves on. God's just what? Come in and finish it, right? That's what you wanted. You wanted those idols. You wanted the abomination. You wanted all those things. You chose that path. That was the things that you desired. And He's just letting them reap what they sow as it relates to that.
He told them what would happen if they went that way.
Yeah, there's plenty of warning within the Scriptures, right? And as reminders to us and also to them that God told that you choose these things and these consequences will occur.
He gave him a chance to change.
And that's always been the case with God. Judgment comes, I don't want to say as a last resort's not the right phrase, but you understand what I'm saying. It's the end of a process. God doesn't just jump there. He allowed for time, purpose, messengers, every ounce of whatever was necessary to lead them back into a right relationship with Him. They chose to ignore them all. And no wonder there's great mourning then. There's no wonder there's such sadness. Because you can imagine standing up there and looking down, if you escape to the mountains and you're looking down at all this, it's just horrendous what's going on in that place. And we caused it. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? So let's look at the last section. Verse 23. Make a chain, for the land is full of bloody crimes, and the city is full of violence. Wherefore I will bring the worst of the heathen, and they shall possess their houses. I will also make the pomp of the strong to cease, and their holy places shall be defiled. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. Mischief shall come upon mischief, and rumor shall be upon rumor, and then shall they seek a vision of the prophet, but the law shall perish from the priest, and counsel from the ancients. The king shall mourn, and the prince shall be clothed with desolation, and the hands of the people of the land shall be troubled. I will do unto them after their way, and according to their deserts will I judge them, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Repeated phrase, right? Throughout the book of Ezekiel thus far. They shall know that I am the Lord. They shall know that I am the Lord. At the end of the day, all of this is about that. Both those residents of Jerusalem and Judea and also the heathen nations. Remember, because we talked about that a few weeks ago, about the fact that when the remnant gets out and they find themselves in those other nations, they're supposed to declare and tell them what? Yeah, why that happened. God did that. Our God did that. We chose an unrighteous path, and our God did that. It's not a sign of weakness on His part. It's a sign of power because He chose that. And so he asked that last question in this worksheet, then what will be the state of the government in the day of the Lord? You kind of see that towards the end of that section. There's really a simplistic thought I get out of that anyway. Let me ask it this way. Are they any different than everybody else? Not really. Some of them will be given certain privileges and brought back into captivity, and we've seen some of that throughout. But the truth is they're all met with the same fate. And they all meet with the same consequence and challenge, and they're no exception to that. The king will mourn. The prince shall be clothed with desolation. The hands of the people of the land shall be troubled. Everyone. No one is exempt. Everything collapses from government to commerce. Remember we talked earlier in the narrative about buyers and sellers and how all of that just kind of goes away. Everything collapses. I don't know that it's hard for us to vision, right? Because we don't, culture, it's hard for us to even make sometimes connections to how they lived and behaved, but they were a civilization. They had, basic functions that are common to us, and you buy and sell, and you live day to day, and you experience various things, and it all goes down. Everything collapses because of their choices and decisions. Questions, thoughts, comments, ruminations, considerations? Anything you got left out of that chapter that we didn't cover? I apologize that I didn't quite finish it last week.
What's that there in verse 26? The law will perish from the priest.
Yeah.
Does that mean Abel? I don't know exactly what that means.
Well, and I think, Jim, and I appreciate you bringing that up because I didn't necessarily talk a little bit about that, and that's an important facet. Notice that he says, mischief upon mischief. There's going to be trouble everywhere. Can you imagine, you're living in this besiegement, and could you imagine the rumors that are going around? And you go down to the marketplace and there's nothing to buy or sell, and the various events and circumstances, you can just hear the buzz, right? And people, getting their information via the, person-to-person kind of communication. But back to that question then, so in the same verse, then shall they seek a vision, then, now you want a prophet to come. I've only been sending them for years, but now you want a prophet. Now you want to go to the priest and listen to the law and instructions of God when that's been available, and God says, no.
Now it's too late.
It's too late. Yeah. That's the imagery I get there. That they'll finally... if you watch the layers of history, and we don't have time to go back and look at it all, but if you just watch the layers of history throughout this time period, even throughout the Babylonian captivity, or besiegements, because they come in and God basically said to those kings, what? If you behave, we'll get through it. But they rebelled, and that king got replaced with a worse one. And then clear through Zedekiah. Right? And all this time, they've reached a point where, so you'd think, which one of those layers should they have considered to be rock bottom? At which moment should they have gone, this is the bottom, we need to figure this out. We need to look to the prophets, we need to look to the law, we need to look to the priests. And God says basically they're going to hit the bottom where nothing is left that can be done to stop the judgment of God. And the truth is, there's coming a day, the time nor the hour we do not know, as a thief in the night, all those conversations that the New Testament writers speak of. But there's coming a day where mankind will hit the rock bottom. and God will send His Son, and the opportunities to seek out wisdom and guidance from the testimony of God will be over. It's a great question. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah.
But the vision here, is that and reflecting back forward to when the temple is done away with, the Old Testament is done away with, and Christ has rent the Holy Testament? Is that what is meaning when it says the priest shall not have the authority of the law or whatever, however it reads?
That's not what I saw. Is that a fair enough answer? I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that's not what I think he's talking about in the moment. That the law will perish, not that God's law can't withstand the circumstances. It perishes in that sense, like it's gone forever. But it's left them. And though they might seek a prophet, and though they might seek the information from the law, from the priest, and though they might seek counsel from the ancients, at the end of that phrase. Well, what would that be? Well, that would have to be going back and trying to learn something from past history, right? And why did they wait? That was available to them all along. So that's what I saw. I saw just in the moment, they waited way too long, and now they want to, seek out those things that they should have been seeking all along. Again, that's just my understanding of it. I told you when we started the book of Ezekiel that I'm perfectly willing to be wrong on some of the imagery and so forth that's there.
I thought that was the answer to the 10th question, was the perishing of the law.
Yeah, and that could be that what's the state of the government? Well, they are disconnected from the very law that should have been leading and guiding them, because for a period of time they're going to be under what? Somebody else's law. They're going to be under somebody else's law. And so maybe that could very well be a picture that being described here as well. That law perishes from them because they're not going to be able to serve under that law for a period of time. And that's a great illustration as well. Go ahead, Brian.
I found a similar passage in Malachi where God is rebuking the Levitical priesthood. And this, I was reading, and it kind of matches. It's in Malachi chapter 2, 1 through 8. But I'm just going to read the last 8 and 9.
Okay. He's in Malachi chapter 2, verses 8 and 9.
Malachi chapter 2. And there's a whole list of them. I just focused on 8 and 9. Malachi 2, 8 and 9. And this was the summation for me. But ye are departed out of the way. Ye have caused many to stumble at the law. Ye have corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore I have also made you contemptible and base before all people. That's what you kind of talked about.
Yeah.
Base before all people. According as ye have not kept my ways, but have been partial in the law.
Yeah. And it is, I'm thinking about, because what's sad about that, when's he write that? Well after.
Well, yes.
After they've come back. So in other words, it happened again. And it's amazing how repetitive those challenges came, but it happened again. Some of the last, you think about how sad that is, some of the last things God says to his people before he just doesn't say anything for centuries is, you went back and did the very same things that caused so much trouble in the past. Didn't learn anything. That's a great illustration of comparison of how their pattern didn't seem to change.
And even in the time of Jesus, that's where they're headed. The law is partial to the rich, to the ones in power.
Right, and you're right, that Malachi's prophecy here about how they've become partial as it relates to the law is just exacerbated over that 400-year span of time. And by the time you reach the time of Jesus, you can't hardly even recognize the law because they had so manipulated and perverted and changed and established it to fit what they wanted. Yeah, it's amazing how completely different that appears when you get to the time of Jesus. And that's a great illustration. So then the final question or thought question he gave was, what principle of justice does God apply in all his judgments? And you see it in chapter 7 and verse 27 and Romans 2 and verse 6. And what is it basically?
What he says is final.
Okay. When God speaks, it's final. What else do you see in those texts? Romans 2 and verse 6, when you add that, according to their deeds. According to what? So I think the point of asking that kind of question is we're told to resolve the same basic issue. Theirs might have been a very earthly kind of severity of judgment that God brought against a physical nation of people, but it was because he was rendering according to their deeds, and it should serve as a picture that that's exactly what Paul said in Romans chapter 2 and verse 6 was going to happen to everybody. According to their deeds, the judgment will ultimately come. And when I have to stand before God, that'll be the end result of that. Thoughts, questions, anything about chapter 7? I've left an entire 7 minutes for chapter 8. This will be really good. All right, let's at least introduce it, talk about it a little bit. We won't get far, I'm sure, but we'll at least take a peek at chapter 8. So let's set the stage a little bit here, and let me see if I can get that other set of questions up here. So we've been using this material as an aid to us, and he references what he calls a memory verse. We've just been using it as kind of a central themed moment before we get into the text itself. But notice with me chapter 8, verse 6. He said, "Furthermore unto me, Son of man, seest thou what they do, even the great abominations that the house of Israel committeth here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary, but turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations." And so basically that sets the tone for chapter 8, that what's basically God's going to bring a vision to Ezekiel, and he's going to see what? The abominations that are going to be occurring there. In what particular place? At the temple. So much so that verse 6 tells us that God said, I did what? And about I should go afar off from my sanctuary. What's going to be happening there will be so much of an abomination in the eyes of God, he can't stay. He can't even stay. It will move me far off from my sanctuary. And when I reveal this to you, you think you've seen some bad things, then verses 7 through 16, basically, he's going to unveil even more abominations. And, you know, there's a pattern among God's people in those days. I suppose that pattern continues today, some as well, where maybe there's a judgment that God brings, or a judgment God says he will bring, and people tend to go, well, what did I do? Go back to Brian mentioned Malachi a little bit ago. That's the exact same thing. So what they're doing, basically Ezekiel's going to write the record book. Let me tell you what you did. You know, nobody's going to be able to step back and say, well, we didn't do anything. I don't understand why God's so upset with us. I don't understand why God would bring such a calamity and judgment against us. And Ezekiel's going to get a vision to be able to record exactly what they had been doing that would bring such a calamity. And if you remember, Malachi says kind of the same things. They're going to go, what? Wherein did we pollute your altars? Wherein did we make poor sacrifices? How did we do that? And the excuse making begins. Ezekiel's going to write a record book here. And when they wonder how it is that God would make such a decision to remove himself far away from the sanctuary that was built and intended for him, you'll be able to see very clearly as to why he would do such a thing. So it comes to pass, verse 1 of chapter 8, that in the 6th year, in the 6th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I sat in mine house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of the Lord, there's that phrase we've looked at in the past, the hand of the Lord God fell there upon me. And so the first question I believe that's asked is, when does Ezekiel receive this second vision of Jehovah? So when's it come?
6 years, 6 months, 5 months.
Okay. So let's give a little relevance to that. So when is that related to when we're told the message at Chebar, the river, comes to him in the very beginning? Yeah, so roughly, depending on which calendar you're thinking of and what looking at, but a little over a year is the way we would see that. A little over a year from the first time he encounters the glory of the Lord there beside the river Chebar to now. So a long span of time has gone by. And so these things are most likely then occurring after what that we read about. There were allotment of days and things, right? When it came to those 430 days, and he's going to lay on his side, 394, right? So you get through all of that process and all of that symbolic vision of what's going on back home. And then now another set of vision comes to him. And this time, God's going to take him through this vision in to see what's happening and the abominations and concerns that are going on there. So that's, if you calculate that, and apologize when I did some work to make this big enough for the screen, that should say, where is he and with whom, not W-O-1-Y, right? With whom is he? So who's he with?
The elders of Judah.
Okay. And verse 14, if you add that, then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tamar. So my point, though, is and again, we're borrowing these materials just to simplify it for us a little bit in our process, but when you add that verse, who is with him? Who's the he of verse 14? That's the Lord. Okay? So I think if you go back and then you read that whole narrative, that's the Lord. So I think really what the writer was driving at here of who is with him. He sees those elders. He sees those women. He sees various individuals within the vision, but it's the Lord guiding him through it. In fact, he's going to be jerked up by what? Yeah, by the hairs of his head, right? The Spirit's going to work in such a way, he's going to grab him and lift him up, and then the Lord's going to carry him through as it relates to those things. And so Lord willing, next Wednesday, I'm trying to remember, back into gospel meeting mode. I'm trying to think about when I'm here and when I'm not. But anyway, I'll be here, Lord willing, next Wednesday. So we'll try to cover chapter 8 so I can, I'm not sure whether Kent will do Ezekiel or whether he'll do something else on the 20th. But anyway, we'll work through that when we get there. But we'll begin back in chapter 8 here and look at this picture of this vision of what's happening back in Jerusalem next week. I'll have to go back and look, Bob. I had the impression this was after completion, but let me go back and look. I'll see if